Welcome to the Florida Veterans for Common Sense meeting. And with no further ado, I'll have our member Jack Merriam introduce our speaker for tonight.
I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our brand new executive director of the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program. We had his predecessor, Dave Tomasco, here several times, and really enjoyed and benefited from not only his technical knowledge, but his ability to communicate technical scientific information in ways that most of the average public could understand. And Dr. Gandy, Ryan Gandy, started for a brief period of time. I think you were our scientist, right? Yes. Okay. And he comes on board from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. His educational background is he got a PhD and a master's degree in mariculture from Texas A&M University, and a bachelor's degree in marine biology from the University of Charleston. I had to look that up, Ryan. I was stationed in the other Charleston, so that was Charleston, West Virginia. And Dr. Gandy today is going to update us on the conditions in the bay and hopefully talk a little bit about whether there may be some opportunities for us to expand our microforest program into growing and or planting mangroves and partnering with the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program. With that, Dr. Ryan Gandy.
Thank you. So today's presentation, I'm going to be talking about managing the bay's health in a changing and changed world. We'll be talking about managing the bay's health in a changing and changed world, because Sarasota and the area around here, it's been a constant set of change going back 100 plus years. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about that. So where the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program works, where we all live, is in the Sarasota Bay Estuary. Now, this is really where our creeks meet the sea. And the reason why I say creeks is because even though we don't have many rivers or any rivers in our estuary. We're fed by creeks that have runoff from the land when we have lots of fresh water on it during our wet season and sometimes during our dry season. But this is a 35-mile coastal lagoon system. These, even though we call them bays, they're really coastal lagoons by their structure and the way they function. This is a 150 square mile watershed, and what a watershed is all those the land surrounding bodies of water that feed the creeks that move into those bodies of water. And in this area, we have 5 embayments in the system. We used to have 4 inlets. Now we have got 5 passes. We've got Midnight Pass opened up. I'm going to talk a little bit about Midnight Pass as we get to the end. I've got some additional slides on that. And we span 2 counties, Sarasota and Manatee. So the change in our area is not a recent one. Change is ever present and constant. And it all started and still revolves around control of the water. The Sarasota Bay watershed was once very wet. If you look in that bottom left image, it looks a lot like the Everglades there, where you see, the salt marsh or actually freshwater marsh there, and you've got little pine forests or pine uplands in the middle. That is actually what used to be out east here. It's kind of hard to see in the map. It's kind of tough, but what you'll see in there are ridges in between the lighter areas, which are your swamps. And those ridges, like Bee Ridge, Tatum Ridge, Lockwood Ridge, all those ridges were known high spots. And in between, there were these very low areas. And when early settlers moved here in the 1800s, they didn't have a lot of area that was dry to work with. So these folks, some of our early settlers, began draining and drying the area really early on, looking at agriculture, trying to get new crops in and have that go. These are the Palmers. And here's back to the 1923 drainage design map. Now what you'll see is the ridges are in pink. This is a really old map, and it's really hard not to see. But in the top left corner, think of that as downtown, east. And west is diagonally across there. And so you'll see several different ridges, Tatum, Bee Ridge, but then you also see the sawgrass marshes in between. You might see in that image a lot of black lines in there, dark lines that look like roads. Those aren't roads. Those are all the drainage systems that were put in the late early 1900s to drain all the land to make it dry enough to where you could work on it, whether it's cattle, whether it's agriculture. But that is when a lot of the manipulation of our land started and the changing in our watershed. And these were moving a lot of the water in directions it didn't naturally move. And what the reason being is under all those marshes was really, really good agriculture land. Sometimes 10 feet of muck, just like you would see in the Everglades where they grow a lot of sugar cane. That was there. And so as they dried it, it exposed it and they could grow crops on it, and it was pretty hardy. So what were the impacts to this? Well, the creeks were altered to become drainage outlets. That's even the same today. You'll see them where you're driving around. It'll say a creek on the side of the road, and you look over and it's not a creek. It's got hard sides to it. That started back then. We've just continued to harden those. This lowered the water tables. It drained ponds, marshes, and agriculture, and later residential development reduced storage capacity in those wetlands. This maximizes the flow of water off the land to get away from all of that development into the watershed. So it creates a situation where we call this flashiness, meaning that the water rushes down and out into the bay very quickly. And what this does is it doesn't allow the habitat, the actual marsh, to do its job, to absorb those nutrients. That's what built up that 10 feet of muck, was years and years and centuries of handling nutrients. So then as we developed more into these drying lands, we started to have more flooding issues. So in the 1960s and 70s, the objective was to remediate for flooding and maximize flow to the bay. So in 1921, this gives you an idea of what your population was. There's supposed to be little black dots on there that you can't see because it was not very many folks. Now, 1950, our population jumps up to about 24,000. Right? So this is going to show you the population change and the development change in our watershed over time. 1960, now you're coming up to about 70,000 folks in this watershed. 1980, here we go, we're in the 200,000s now. And you can see how it went from those small centers around where you might expect, downtown Sarasota, Venice, the areas where you had ports. Now we're expanding out in broader, but it's staying along the coastline. Now you're almost 300,000 by 1990, and you can see how up there by downtown is really expanded out east. It's almost to the edge of the watershed, and you have Venice and all that starting to really push to the east. By 2000, you're almost there are a little over 300,000 folks in this watershed, and the amount of coverage of hard surface is increased. 2010, you're almost to 400,000. Come on, here we go. And by 2020, we are at almost 450,000. By now, we're over pretty close to 500,000 folks in this watershed. But you can see as those areas develop, that's actually, you're watching those hard surfaces spread across the watershed. And so when we say flashiness, what we're seeing is that as we channelize things, you may be able to, I might live 2 miles inland, but the stormwater conveyance is such and so quick that within a couple hours, that water is out in the bay. And so it becomes very important what we put on this watershed and how we handle it as far as it relates to the water quality and the health of the bay long term. So a little bit more history between 1950 and 1990, 80% of Sarasota's mangrove shorelines were altered. Now this is hardening of shorelines with seawalls and things. 39% of the intertidal wetlands of Sarasota watershed were converted to development or agriculture. And this was, prior to the 1990s. And During this time, we also saw a 30% decline in seagrass meadows. So that's representative of the increased amount of stormwater going in, as well as during that period of time, we had a lot of your water treatment plants, they weren't very efficient. A lot of that waste went right out in the bay, as well as other pollutants. So our watershed is 85% urbanized. This is a higher density than Miami. It's higher than what you see in St. Pete and several other areas. It's a very, very urbanized watershed. The remaining, so when you look at this map, what you see is red. Yeah, the hotter colors, that's all the urbanized development. I didn't design this. This came off of our watershed management plan. And the places that are green and maybe a little bit of brown, the green are pastures and a few places. Like if you look at Little Sarasota Bay, that watershed's 95% developed. And the only little green spot in it is Oscar Shear Park, the state park that's there. So, those open lands were needed to absorb and filter that water before it ran off through the watershed to the bay. And loss of these areas really causes that really first flush, or that flush of water into the bay, that it can be problematic at times. So just to give you an idea of how the watershed relates to the bay system it's on. So we have 5 bay systems. We have Palmasola up in the north. That's that little blue one up in the green area up there. You've got Sarasota Bay proper, which is a large blue area, followed by Roberts Bay down below it, which is very small. Little Sarasota Bay right below that, and then Blackburn Bay to the south. So when you look at the amount of watershed that relates to the bay, you can get an idea of the potential for problems in a bay system when there's more land than there is water for it to flow into. So when you look at, say, Palmasola Bay, it's about a 2-to-1. So watershed to open water. So for every 2 acres of watershed, there's 1 acre of open water. When you get to Sarasota Bay, it's about a 4-to-1, right? As you get to Little Roberts Bay there, it's a 33-to-1. That's coming, all that's coming down Philippi Creek into that area. So for every 1 acre of Little Roberts Bay, you've got 33 acres of watershed dumping into that. So you can see where that could be an area we'd want to keep an eye on. Then you have Little Sarasota Bay, which is a 4-to-1, which is pretty reasonable. And then you have Blackburn Bay, which is a 20-to-1 ratio. So you can see how the bay can potentially react to small changes in these big watersheds. So what happens when you have nutrients coming into a bay system from no matter the source? On this graphic, what you see is on the right side represents a high nitrogen load. So when you have a lot of nitrogen going, and as you all remember, nitrogen, it's one of the primary things when you're fertilizing your lawn or anything else. That's really what's going to give you that growth. And it's no different when you put it in a marine system. So when we add a lot of nitrogen on the right side of that, you see a little word called phytoplankton and some dots in the water. What that is microscopic algae. It reacts very quickly to that nitrogen, especially inorganic nitrogen that's really available to them. As it grows, it shades the bottom. And so seagrass can't grow really well. And then, so your light is one of the big things that seagrass depends on. The other thing that can happen in that high nutrient environment is we get macroalgae. That's that rolling algae you see. Some people call it seaweed. It's different from seagrass. That can be a storage device for nitrogen that can continue to re-release that nitrogen for long periods of time and continue problems in the system from high nitrogen. But as you go further to the left, a nitrogen load reduces, you start getting better light penetration, and you kind of reach this Goldilocks zone in the middle where you've got enough nutrients that it can feed the food webs in there very effectively. So your fish get bigger, your manatees have more grass to eat because there's more light getting to the bottom and it has adequate nutrients. But as you get further to the left and your nutrients drop off, that's when you have more open ocean type conditions where you have low nutrients and high light, and the seagrass is not going to grow really well. Well, why do I talk about these different things? Nitrogen, phytoplankton, macroalgae, and seagrass. It's because we use all of those as indicators to understand the health of the bay. So again, you'll see those circles there. That's the nitrogen, the chlorophyll, the seagrass, and the macroalgae. We use all 4 of those metrics, and we assess each bay system based on the levels of those over time. So this is our ecosystem health report card. We use this as a representative of how the bay is doing. The blue, so it's supposed to be a regular stoplight approach. Red, yellow, green, right? We all know that, you know. Red, you got to stop, something's bad. Yellow, caution. Green is go, but we needed a 4th, and stoplights don't have a 4th. So we added blue as really good conditions. So what we do is across the top are the bay systems. Down the left side are the years over time. And for each of those colored squares for each year in a bay system, we looked at those 4 parameters and came up with a number that gave us that color, right? Because it's a scale. And so when you look at Palmasola Bay, throughout time, Palmasola Bay has been a really, really good area. But the remainder of our bays had some difficulties. Now, what we use is what we call a reference period, a time when the water quality was good, you had good seagrass growth, low macroalgae growth, and that was a period from 2006 to 2012. That was a time when the system was working really good. We had 30% increases in seagrass. We had much better water quality. But then when we entered the period from 2013 to 2019, we call this our degraded period. And you can see how the scores drop into yellows and reds during that period. A lot of this degraded period came from dissolved inorganic nitrogen loads. And this fed the macroalgae as well as the phytoplankton blooms and resulted in a 30% decline in our seagrass coverage throughout the bay. Now, a lot of this came from the wastewater overflows that we had during that time. We had a big expansion. You saw on the charts that big expansion in population, and a lot of our wastewater systems couldn't keep up. And then we had a lot of rain events that were causing infiltration to get into those wastewater pipes and cause too much water to have to be processed, resulting in overflows. And during that period, there was almost 1 billion gallons of wastewater overflows. And with that carried that inorganic nitrogen that is a very good fertilizer for our bay systems, and it caused a lot of problems. Also, we had stormwater coming in during that period of time. We had some red tides that were triggered during that period of time. Anybody was around here, that 17, 18 red tide, even to 19, was pretty bad, very bad. And that red tide will actually feed itself by the nutrients from all the decaying fish and everything else that come in. So it was a really bad time for our system, but we know it was triggered by a high nitrogen load. So our bay systems, all 5 of them, were declared impaired for nutrients during that period by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. They regulate water bodies. So what happened to make the change? Because as you see, starting in about 2020, 2021, the colors start changing for the better. Well, we fixed our wastewater problems. We haven't had any significant flows in the overflows in Sarasota County in the past few years. Those major sources were gone. There were some big improvements to stormwater. The Bobby Jones Golf Course is a good example, but there are many other improvements to stormwater to slow that water down and allow it to be filtered before it comes in. And so the bay started to improve during that period of time. We had a 20% increase in seagrass coverage. We had also concurrently about 12 tons of nitrogen load was dropped out of the system during that period of time. And we saw the bay start to get better. But the other thing is we were wondering, as we had other things like Hurricane Ian and Tropical Storm Nicole, those brought a lot of rain, a lot of runoff into the system. We thought, oh my gosh, here it goes again. Now, there were isolated problems from those, but it wasn't a bay-wide catastrophe to get us back. So we were thinking, well, maybe the bay's got some resiliency to it. And then we got the 2021 Piney Point disaster where we spilled all the nitrogen and phosphorus and nitrogen were spilled out of that caused problems, but we worked our way out of that. So we use this indicator to kind of see where we're going, and we're looking at it now that we think we're in a recovery period with this. So Sarasota Bay, all 5 bay systems are no longer impaired for nutrients, that was as of 2023. And that is a huge thing because not many, if any, other regions in our state can say that all their water bodies or open water bodies like that are not impaired. So the proof is in the pudding here, and we're doing pretty well. Also, we saw, this is a seagrass coverage over time. As of 2024, we're almost to 12,000 acres of seagrass coverage. The main recovery was in the upper part of the bay. Our lower bays are still, we're still looking at those closely, and I'll talk about those here in a little bit. You know, it's like anything. You still have to be vigilant. You can't sit back and say, look, we did great, let's walk away from this, because we've got to hold the line strategy. And we're looking over the next 30 years of what we're going to do, because we've got sea levels coming up. We've got high tides. You know, I can't tell you how many times people call us and say, why is my water over my dock? And it's not, you know, a king tide, or why is it high? You know, so we're seeing this, and everybody's seeing this in their daily lives, but also temperature and tropical events. The tropical events, we saw the result of 2024 for firsthand. So sea level data, a lot of people say, oh, you show me a graph. I don't know, you know, it's numbers or whatever. This is the location at St. Pete, looking at sea level rise since 2000. And what we see is that there's been about 3 inches of rise per decade. And this concurs with the state's assessment of the potential for sea level to rise over time. But I always like to look at the slide or the picture that I have there, because I always think that that biology, even if you don't believe the numbers, biology is going to tell you what's going on. So this is showing that 6 inches of sea level rise in 2 decades, so about 3 inches. But when you look at the picture on the bottom, that's over 100-year-old seawall that I'm working on right now. We're actually doing a shoreline restoration project. We're going to pull that seawall out and make a living shoreline out of it. But when this was put in, stormwater guys, when you talk to them, you say, hey, do you guys put your stormwater pipes underwater when you put them out in the bay? They say, no, why would I do that? I'd leave it at the water line. These things 100 and some years ago were above the water when they came through. So you can see all the growth. This is at a lower tide, all the growth of oysters on that show you what that tidal range is, where at high tide, that thing is completely covered. So you've got water and oysters growing back probably 100 feet in this pipe. The other thing is, if you look in the trend in temperatures, so on the left, you're going to see months, on the right, years, and this goes back, I think this one's to 1880 or something like that, because we've got great temperature records going way back. Thermometers were developed a long time ago, and they were calibrated. So you look at it over time, you see how the graph gets redder and redder, especially since the 1980s. And this is monthly average temperatures for our region. And you can see that we're having more warm temperatures throughout the year. And what temperature does, it drives a few things. As you get higher temperatures, if you get higher temperatures, you're going to have more chances for growing red tide, Karenia brevis. We actually have about a month and a half more every year where there's a potential for red tide to grow because the temperatures are warmer. The same thing with another harmful algal bloom, Dapis, which is Lyngbya. It's a stringy looking stuff you see in the water. We've got, again, about a month and a half more of good growing times for that. So as we get higher temperatures, some of these things that will impact the bay, or these things that will impact the bay over time, have more potential to do so if we don't keep our nutrients in balance. And the other thing with temperature, did anybody remember when we used to go out and run out and cover all your stuff with sheets, right? You had a whole set, right? I mean, I had a whole, Scooby-Doo ones and all sorts of stuff, whatever your old sheets were. I don't have those anymore. We actually scramble if someone says there's going to be a hard freeze, and we haven't had one of those since 2010. So even in your own life, you're seeing these changes over time, and we have to continue to be aware of those for the benefit of the bay. And tropical storms, those are heat engines. Simply put, the reason why we don't get hurricanes in the winter, water's too dang cold. Once that water heats up and starts the convection, starts to rise up, it'll start to spin because of the Coriolis effect, just like the water going down your drain. And the more heat you put in that system, the stronger those storms are going to get. So all of these, the storms, the heat, everything comes together. So before Ian, this is my great visual. well, at first it's all the storms. And once I get to 2024, I just refer to them as the storms of 24 anymore, because there are 4 events in there that were major, 100-year, 500-year event. You know, it was once in a lifetime events. But what happens is you can see the changeover in the bay from before Ian, where you had that gin clear water we all love, to after Ian, which is all rain driven change. And so what these storms do, not only do they bring rain, but they bring an immense amount of pressure to our barrier islands. And here is the storm surge from Helene that opened up Midnight Pass for just a little while. And then Milton came through and finished the job. Right? And so this is a great, I want you to just make a mental image of the water color that's coming out of the bay here. This is that coming out of Little Sarasota Bay. It's very tannic. Now, tannic water is not polluted water. Tannic water is just like the tea you have in your cup. It's an indication of the type of estuary you have. And these are, when Midnight Pass was closed, that area had a very tannic, very estuarine system, lots of oysters and stuff. And I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. So here's Midnight Pass today. This is a great shot from our partners out at Moat that do their manatee surveys, and they do aerial surveys of the pass. And so what you can see in this is you've got the pass there to the left, the big sandbar off that. It's called an ebb shoal. That's where it pushes the sand out to. And you have 2 channels, one going to the left and one going to the right, that feed that pass. And the pass is only going to get as big as the amount of water that can flow in and out of it. So how much water can flow out of Little Sarasota Bay is what limits the size of that pass. If you want to make it any bigger, you just have to spend a lot of money to dredge it and keep dredging it. But as a wild pass, it has been stable for a year. But I want to tell you a little bit about barrier islands and how they move. So you're going to see on the top left, you see a place that says Bird Key. It's right there on the right side of that image near Casey. That's where Midnight Pass is now for reference. On the left side, you'll see a circle. That's 1888, the Blind Pass. If anybody knows Heron Lagoon that is up there, that was a pass that used to come through and feed into that area. That closed over time through 1920s. Musketeer or Midnight Pass opened. It starved that old Blind Pass up there by Heron Lagoon. That closed by 1924. You just had Midnight Pass. And then in 1984, we know what happened then. We had some fellows that didn't like the fact that the pass was getting too close to their house, so they took bulldozers and closed in the pass and tried to relocate it further south, which did not work. Mother Nature says, no thanks, I know what I'm doing. But how do barrier islands move? So there's a little image here. Watch the waves of sand. This is Big Pass, and you're seeing sand come off of the tip of South Lido on the top, move its way around through the pass, and then stick itself to North Siesta on the bottom. Here's one more run of it, and then you see the sand working its way down the beach. Our barrier islands are in constant motion. We always think of them as solid things that are always going to be there, but we're kind of the dummies that build a lot of hard structures right on these things and expect them to stay. They do move, and that movement is what creates our barrier islands. It creates a sand transport for them. It opens and closes them, but also it builds them. Because we didn't have barrier islands 5,000 years ago. Sea level was much lower. We didn't have any of that. As the sea level came in, it brought the sand. We built barrier islands and these lagoons behind it. So it's never been like this, and it never will be like this again. We're in this constant motion. So I want to take you back a little bit in time. This is a 1948 aerial of Midnight Pass, and you can see Midnight Pass there on the right. You can see its location and how it had 2 channels, one to the right and one to the left feeding it. And then you have the intercoastal in the background. So I'm going to take you through time. You're going to see a red dot. This is the furthest extent of Siesta Key back in 1948. And notice Midnight Pass was right there below it. Okay? And where Midnight Pass is today and where it settled, where it's today is very far, about just south there. Sorry, it's hard to point on this. But I just keep an eye on that red dot. And I want to show you how this pass moves back and forth over time till it got closed. There's 1957, so almost 10 years, and that thing has put a spit out from it. So now it's building land on the south end of Siesta. 1969, that's still fairly stable. That land is filling in more, looking like some good places we might put a house or two, because maybe we forgot that there's a pass used to go right through there. 1972, still a stable pass. So within about 15 years, anybody that was around was like, hey, that pass is pretty good. It's staying put. It's right where we want it to be. 1978, the pass says, no. I want to go back north, my old channel. And it moved back into that old setup, and see how much sand it had eroded from the south end of Siesta. This is a zoom in of 1983. And you can see there's a tree line in there. There are houses. So we started building as close to that pass, the old channel for the pass. And in 1983, when it got too close and started to really impact those homes, that's when the bulldozers came in and they closed in the pass. The private owners did. And we'll run through these. 1986, you can't even tell the pass was there. 1995, it's stabilized. You can see how there's dunes forming along that beach. There's 2001, still same system. 2011, and I like 2011. It's a special time for me, but then I'll tell you that in a sec. But the barrier island there, if anybody wanted to go to Midnight Pass, we all would go over there. There might be 1, 2, or 3 boats, a couple kayaks. It was a park that you walked over a very large sand dune to get out there and enjoy it. And I used to go out there with my family, and it was a really quiet area. In this quiet area, there's my son Kyle. He was born in 2011. In his first Florida baptism, I took him out there in August when it was nice tepid water, and we soaked in it for a little bit at Midnight Pass on the Gulf side. But it's also an area where manatees have their calves. It's a very quiet area for them. That's what it's evolved into for them. On the left, you can see that park and the walkover for it. And so it was a different area. And when we talk about the manatees in that area, it was a hot spot. Our colleagues at Moat provided these graphics of what a hot spot it was for our area, because it had slow speed zones. Outside the intercoastal, you have to idle. Also, it was a refuge for red tide. When we had our big red tides, manatees packed into this area to get relief from it because the salt content was lower. Red tide had to go 7 miles one way or the other to try to get in there. So the intensity was kept down because it didn't have that access to it. And also the seagrass. We have over 600 acres of seagrass in this area, a lot of it right there around where Midnight Pass is. So this is an important area for our seagrass, and that's what feeds our manatees too, as well as our fish populations. When we look at our fisheries independent monitoring samples, we work with the Florida Fish and Wildlife to go pull seines and nets throughout the bay every 2 months on a regular basis year round. And we've been doing this since 2009. And what it showed was what older studies that Moat had done had showed, is that it was a very productive system. It was more of a nursery system. We have a lot of small things in there because you got the great fresh water that came in. The pass was closed. It held it for a long time. And remember when I first started talking and said we don't have any permanent rivers that come in here. So you have dry seasons where the salinity goes way up in our open bays, whereas back here in Little Sarasota Bay, you had enough fresh water coming in over time. It was an area with lower salt content, so you had a lot more oysters. You had a lot of that tannic water, a lot of people said was polluted or is a problem. That's actually that would be the norm for that type of environment. So this was a very productive area for that. But we did have our problems in Little Sarasota Bay. It's not all roses with it. So what would happen whenever we got these big rain events? Now think back to that watershed map. If you had a house that was developed after the mid 1980s, early 1990s, you didn't have a community that had, or built before that, you didn't have a community that had modern stormwater rules and conveyances. My neighborhood, 1948 house, everything drains into the street that runs all the way down and one collection point that goes out. There's no remediation for that. And so what happens in those older neighborhoods on the island, within the fringe of the land side of the coast, those are all those older communities. And that water rushes in with all the load that it can carry when we have big events like Helene and Milton and things. So on the left, you see a slide where you have that nice tannic brown water in the front. This is like a black and tan, and in the back, you see that gray water. When you see gray water like that, that is a good indication that you've got a lot of storm water runoff in our area. And this was after, I think this was after Helene. But what happens is that fresh water rides over the salt water on the bottom and kind of caps it and prevents the oxygen from mixing too well. And so that what will end up happening is your oxygen drops and you get fish kills. And we would have those pretty regularly when we had big floods into Little Sarasota Bay. And part of this is because of the exchange rate of water in that bay. When they cut the intercoastal waterway through there, it first reduced the flow because it sent more water out north and the south. So Venice to the south and Big Pass to the north. Then when the pass was open during that period, you had about a 74% exchange of water over a 10-day period. So it was still flushing pretty good. When it closed, that dropped to about a 27% exchange in 10 days. It was holding a lot of that water. So when you have a big rain event that brings a lot of the stormwater in there, you can't get rid of it very quickly. And it very quickly had made problems for that. But what we saw is with the improvements we have seen with wastewater and stormwater over time, not volume of stormwater, but the quality of that water with less nitrogen in it going in over time, we saw both nitrogen and chlorophyll begin to drop. So the water quality was getting better. That's why they delisted it in 2023. And so with that higher exchange rate, you can see that the bay is no longer like that first slide after Milton opened it, where it's that tannic water pouring out and all that rainwater. It is much different system now. But I want you to notice the amount of white you see inside the pass going along the barrier islands and around. That is all sand that was transported over the barrier island with the storms and deposited on the seagrass beds in there. So we're really watching those grass beds very closely to see how they recover over time. So one of the big things is, besides the recovery we're monitoring, we also want to encourage people to be good stewards of this area, because for so long the area had very little boat traffic. And now it's a place to go. I go there. Lots of people go there. It's really nice. But the problem with it is that it's not a navigable waterway. So they can't mark it with channel markers. So folks, if they don't know, or if no one's told them, they don't know to go in that south channel and hug that shoreline to get through Midnight Pass. And then getting out of Midnight Pass, forget it. You got to figure that out, and it changes on a weekly basis because of the sandbar that's there. But what it does is it puts a lot of us in contact with a lot of those manatees that have been in that area, with a lot of the seagrass that's working to recover in the area. So I encourage everybody to, when you're in that area, think about your stewardship of it. Think about, how you're interacting with it. A good example is in that bottom right. It's hard to see on this, but there's some manatees and some paddleboarders. And, paddleboarders, they went over, wanted to see some manatees. The manatees said, no, thank you. You see them, their trails moving out of there, but it's pushing them back into the channel where the boats are. So we have to be very careful of how we interact with critters down there, just for their well-being. And so the biggest question I get is, what's going to happen? Is this thing going to stay open? On the left is a picture of when it was closed, and the right was when it was open. You can see all that sand. That was right after the hurricanes. But the county has a plan for this. They have a past management plan. They're also working with the University of South Florida and University of Florida, and they're doing their own transect. And this is their transect information. What they do is, on a weekly basis, they have survey points that cross right there at the mouth of the pass. They're fixed points, and they measure the depth from their survey down. So it gives them an idea how high the beach is, and then as they get into the pass, how low the pass is, how wide the pass is, and then where the south side beach is. So this is that transect, the red line. That's the one they're taking vertical measurements on as they go through. And what they found over time, this is also overlaid with a lot of the work that University of South Florida is doing. There's a coastal scientist, Ping Wong, is doing a bunch of work with graduate students there to look at the amount of flow that goes through and estimate that amount of flushing that comes from Little Sarasota Bay and see if it will keep it open over time. So from all this data, we've got a year's worth of data. And what's the pass been doing? Well, what we notice is in the winter, the pass gets shallower and narrower. And the summer, it gets wider and deeper. And that's a function of how big our tides are. Anybody who fishes in the winter knows that you got to watch out a little bit running in the shallows because it's a lot shallower. But in the summer, we get those king tides. We have big tides at the end of the summer that have helped flush it out. So some of the triggering points that will be implemented for dredging, or where they would just do some spot dredging in there to open it back up, would be whether the throat's cross section gets below 500 square feet. Also, if the movement off its center line goes 100 feet one way or the other. It's already done that a little bit, but it moved right back. It's moved north and it's moved south a couple times over this past year. Or if there's an imminent closure. For example, you have a storm that takes and pushes a lot of sand in there. Those would be reasons they can go in. So they've got engineers working on it. They've got folks working on the hydrodynamics to see what would be appropriate for this. But so far, it's a great wild pass. I mean, it's a thing to behold because we don't have a lot of unconstrained passes anymore. A lot of folks throw jetties on them that cause all sorts of other erosion problems. With that, I just wanted to mention that, what we see is that, our job's not done. We have a lot more to do, but the cleaner our bay is, the more resilient it is. And we've seen that through these last several hurricanes and several cycles that we've had. So with that, I wanted to thank you all for listening to my talk. I think we have some time. If anybody's got any questions, I'm glad to take those. I know we covered a broad range of topics. So.
Ryan, back to the 80% of the mangroves we've lost. What kind of opportunity do you see for us to begin to try and plant more mangroves, restore some of the mangrove shoreline that we've lost? It seems like, every neighborhood is different. My neighborhood, there are some mangroves growing in front of the seawall and so on. And it's fairly common over on Longboat Key to see mangroves in front of the seawalls and so on. So I wonder, it's not necessarily that we're going to get everybody to take out their seawall, but what kind of opportunities, and I know that the estuary program has done some restoration projects that have gone quite well.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up because that is one of our biggest challenges. We have a couple different habitats that are important to us. We had what were called salt terns, which are low salt areas, and a lot of those have gone because the challenge we have is that our coastline is mostly in private hands, right? And so it's how you handle your property. Whereas when I go to Tampa Bay, go to Charlotte Harbor, there are a lot of shorelines out there that are agriculture or they're, something else like the south side of Tampa Bay. So our challenge, one, is finding enough places to do that work. Two is also showing, and that's what the estuary program's been working on, showing how you can convert these hard shorelines back to something that's resilient, but also it's more of a natural shoreline where you can have room for mangroves. Then, the other thing is it shows what opportunities people have when their seawall is failing. There's some good examples of putting either things like reef balls that you can put mangroves in to help build that. Because I will tell you, and this is the thing a lot of people realize that we're cutting their mangroves very short, is that when we had Helene and Milton come through, I went to a bunch of properties out on the Keys, and if they had a little stretch of mangroves in front of their harbor for their boats or their shoreline, if they had left that mangrove and it was 6-8 feet tall, and granted, mangroves should be about 25 or 30 feet tall. There's a whole nother thing there. But if they just trimmed them to 7-8 feet, a lot of the time the boats were still on the lifts. The docks were still in place. So that's the thing, is conveying that these things can help your property more than just, get them. But when you trim them low, you would go to those properties and you look and there's a couple $100,000 boat upside down, in the drink. And then you see a lot of the damage from the first floor beyond flooding. They won't stop flooding, but they stop that energy coming in. It's just like the dunes on the beach. But it's a big challenge to find space to do that. So one of the things that we try to encourage is that showing people what they can do for you and what you can do to have them in front of you, but still be able to see out in front without cutting them low, without doing that. So there's a whole education component that's important. The challenge that we're all going to face in this and trying to find space is just that, where to do this. And we've largely focused on municipal areas where we're up in Rose Park right now, which is up in right there on Palmasola, where there's that 100-year-old seawall. And it's an opportunity to go in and change that shoreline around. A lot of the mangroves, if you open that shoreline, they'll recruit back to it just from seed. But I think where the biggest help would be is in your own local community. Finding those opportunities, we have willing folks to put in mangroves and helping them get the resources for it. It's a challenge and we haven't been able to overcome it. And we're really worried that over time, as sea level keeps coming up, mangroves are going to get squeezed up against hard structures. So they need to migrate. They're a walking plant. That's what they are. And they walk inland above the water height that they can stand. And the problem is behind a lot of these, we've got a lot of houses too. So we're looking at some different options, and we're glad to keep the conversation going about it. Or as we have volunteer opportunities to do some planting in those areas. But we're struggling to find those open spots where you've got that willingness to be able to put mangroves in.
There we go.
Yep.
You said that you're saying for fish,
Mm-hmm.
and this is just personal observation, but it seems like to me in the canals, anywhere near my house, there's a lot less mullet
Mm-hmm.
than there was. I mean, every year it seems like there's less and less.
Yeah.
Is that verified by the evidence that you're finding and the data that you're turning up, or is that just me being unlucky?
No. I thought you were going to ask me where to go fishing. So we work with the Florida Fish and Wildlife, their fisheries independent monitoring, to come down, and they use their standardized system for monitoring that. But one thing on the mullet front is that over time we've seen drops in those bait fish populations. And that's mullet you can consider a bait fish as well. They really rely on more nutrient-rich environments. And if you look at the coast of Florida, it's been on a real nutrient diet for a long time because we've been managing by seagrass coverage and pushing back on nutrient inflow. So with that, you've got a lot less energy in the system. So those bait fish have a lot less energy to feed off of. And you're seeing smaller bait fish populations in general in areas. Now, that's also due to habitat loss. So it's a multi-edged sword. So when you got to harken back to your mental image of the coast of Sarasota, it's not Louisiana marshes, it's not mangrove forests of of the Everglades, it's hardened shorelines. You've lost so much habitat in that system, the biomass that it can support is going to drop. And our dominant habitat now is seagrass because we've lost so much of the other that it's by and large. And mullet aren't seagrass dependent. They really like those creeks, those backwaters, those mangrove shorelines and things. Those are areas that are really important to them. However, now that you have a pass there, you have a good chance that you may have more egg supply coming in, because the mullet, you're going to see them school up. So January, February, when we get those really, really rough cold fronts, and you'll see those mullet guys go out there and start striking in the bay and cast netting them, or running out in the Gulf and cast netting them. They're going for the roe mullet, because the mullet go out off the beach, they spawn, and those eggs come in through the inlet. So there may be a bump in those fish populations over the next few years as more of those eggs can get into and larvae can get back into the bay, which they couldn't before. They had to go 7 miles each side, right? So that fisheries independent monitoring is something we're going to be looking at more closely, and we're going to add those kind of things, looking at especially finfish, looking at oyster populations, things like that, with our ecosystem health report card so we can get a better idea of what the system in total is looking like, not just the nutrient side of things. So that's kind of a roundabout way, but there's a lot of components to that bait fish population.
It's complicated.
It is. It is.
Rich, any more questions from Zoom land? Okay. We'd like to thank Dr. Gandy. It's really been a terrific talk. There's more information than any of us can absorb in a short talk like this, and we really appreciate it. It's not easy to put together, and thank you for your hard work
Thanks for having me.
making our environment better.
I appreciate it.